Why did the laughter bother her less than the silence? Kane noticed it the moment she shut off the engine, not the polished cars, not the glass walls reflecting the mountains. It was the way no one looked at her long enough to be curious. They saw the truck, the dust, the worn edges, and made a decision before she even stepped out. She sat there for half a breath longer than necessary, hands resting on the steering wheel, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. She'd been in worse places, louder places, places where judgment came in other forms. Still, this one carried a familiar weight, the kind that settled quietly in the chest. She stepped down from the cab, slung the rifle case over her shoulder, and closed the door with care. That care wasn't politeness, it was habit. The valet's reaction came exactly when she expected it, too quick, too rehearsed. The glance, the dismissal, the hand raised like she was traffic, not a person. She didn't argue. Arguing would mean she needed permission. She took the long walk instead, gravel grinding under her boots, dust rising around her calves. Each step felt heavier than it should have, but not because of the incline. As she climbed, her mind wandered to other hills, other walks, long ones, silent ones, places where you learned quickly that dignity didn't come from how people treated you, but how you carried yourself when they didn't. She adjusted the strap on her shoulder. The rifle bumped lightly against her back, familiar, grounding. Inside, the air changed. Clean, cold, expensive. Eyes followed her now, not with interest but irritation. As if she were a smudge on glass, she felt it, let it pass through. The guard at security didn't bother hiding his contempt. The way he dumped her bag, the way her gear clattered louder than necessary. Each sound echoed just long enough to draw attention. She said nothing, watched everything. Control wasn't loud. Control was choosing what deserved a response. By the time she reached the counter, she felt that old tightening in her chest. Not fear, something else. The awareness that she was being weighed and found wanting by people who didn't know what weight really was. The manager's voice dripped with practiced politeness. The brochure slid across the counter like an insult wrapped in gloss. She didn't take it. "Lane 7, she said. It wasn't defiance, it was certainty. The rifle case opened with a soft sound, wood and steel revealed without ceremony. No shine, no spectacle, just a tool that had done its job long before anyone here had learned the language to describe it. The whispers started immediately. She felt the phones come up. The snickers, the staged sympathy from strangers who wanted her failure to decorate their feeds. Ignored, that was the emotion that sat closest to the surface. Ignored but watched. There was a difference. Ignored meant invisible. Watched meant waiting for a mistake. She gave them none. The wind picked up as she stepped onto the line. It tugged at her shirt, carried dust across the range. She welcomed it. Chaos always told the truth faster than calm ever did. When Brandt's laugh cut through the air, it didn't surprise her. Men like him always laughed before they listened. His words landed where he intended them to, public, sharp, diminishing. "Wrong gun, sweetheart." She breathed in through her nose, slow, measured, the way she always had before something mattered. "I'm sure," she said. And somewhere deep inside, a door that had been closed for years clicked open just a fraction. But there was still something she hadn't told them. Not yet. What does it feel like when every instinct tells you to walk away, but you stay anyway? Kane felt it as the bet was laid on the bench. The money, the smell of tobacco, the assumption wrapped in entitlement. This wasn't about skill to them. It was about ownership, about control. She felt a flicker of anger then, not the hot kind, the cold kind, the kind that sharpened everything. She remembered other men, other rooms, other challenges that weren't really challenges at all, just traps disguised as opportunity. She had learned early that refusing to play didn't always mean leaving the table. Sometimes it meant changing the rules without saying a word. The range owner's voice followed, layered with authority and doubt. Insurance, standards, equipment lists, all shields, none of them real. She nodded once, more to herself than to him. She wasn't here to prove anything to them, she needed something else. Confirmation, closure, maybe permission from herself to remember who she had been. The small disruptions were intentional, the bumped bench, the flashes, the jokes piped through speakers, each one designed to fracture focus, each one a test. She felt the familiar pressure behind her eyes, the temptation to rush, to force it. She didn't. She slowed down instead. Her hands moved with a calm that came from repetition, not confidence. Confidence could lie. Repetition never did. She wrapped the sling, felt the tension settle into her bones. Her breathing found its rhythm. The world narrowed, not in exclusion, but in clarity. Ignored turned into anxious. Anxious turned into still. The countdown began somewhere behind her. It sounded far away. Everything did. She tracked the wind not with numbers but with memory, with scars, with moments that had taught her how air behaved when it thought no one was paying attention. When the flash went off, she blinked once. That was all, blinked and waited for the image to settle. She thought of nights where silence was louder than gunfire, of names she no longer spoke, of the cost of being precise when precision was the only thing standing between order and catastrophe. The trigger broke clean. The sound traveled outward, the waiting stretched. Then came the ring. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was simple, final. And everything changed. She didn't smile, didn't look back. She stayed where she was because she knew better than to move too soon. She heard the denial immediately, the accusations, the scrambling for explanations that didn't involve admitting error. She cycled the bolt. The second shot came easier, not because it was simpler but because doubt had shifted. It no longer lived in her. It lived in them. By the third, the range wasn't laughing anymore. It was holding its breath. And when the chain snapped, something else broke with it. The idea that she was there by accident. Why is it that recognition always arrives too late? The silence afterward felt heavier than the mockery ever had. Kane felt it press against her shoulders, settle into the space between heartbeats. She lowered the rifle slowly, deliberately. No rush, no triumph. Triumph belonged to people who needed witnesses. She saw the veteran before he spoke, the way his posture changed, the way his eyes narrowed, not with suspicion but memory. Recognition was a language all its own. He understood without explanation. When the guard crossed the line, Kane felt something stir, not fear but readiness. Old instincts rose, uninvited but welcome. She didn't move. She didn't need to. The veteran intervened, and the authority in his voice cut deeper than any weapon ever could. "You're watching a ghost." The words hung there, heavy, accurate. She set the rifle down and reached into her bag. The metal card felt colder than she remembered, or maybe her hands were warmer now. She placed it on the bench. Let them see. Let them not understand. She didn't explain. Explanations were for people who had earned them. As the confirmations came through, she felt something unexpected, a crack in the armor. Not pride, relief, quiet, aching relief. The zero still held. The past hadn't betrayed her. She hadn't imagined it. She hadn't become something less by stepping away. When the money sat untouched, it felt right. Taking it would have meant participating in a system she no longer belonged to. She picked up the casing instead. Light, unassuming, proof enough. Walking away was the hardest part. It always was. Outside, the mountain air felt different, cleaner. The valet's apology barely registered. She took the keys and kept moving, down the hill, back to the gravel, back to herself. That night, as she drove away, she didn't think about the looks on their faces. She thought about the quiet, the stars, the way truth didn't need permission to exist. Sometimes, being seen isn't about stepping into the light. Sometimes, it's about realizing you were never in the dark to begin with. What does it cost to stay quiet when every part of you wants to speak? Kane felt the weight of that question as the laughter settled around her like dust that refused to fall. It wasn't loud anymore. It had thinned into something sharper, whispers, glances, phones angled just enough to capture her without asking. She stayed where she was, hands steady, eyes forward. Staying was harder than leaving. Leaving would have been familiar. Staying meant reopening rooms she had sealed shut years ago. The young woman with the camera hovered close, too close. Kane could smell the artificial sweetness of her perfume, hear the practiced kindness in her voice as she spoke to her audience. It wasn't cruelty, not exactly. It was worse. It was ownership disguised as empathy. Kane felt a flicker of irritation when the woman touched the rifle, fingers brushing the worn wood like it was a museum piece instead of a living thing. Kane shifted her stance just enough to reclaim her space. No words, just a boundary. Her chest tightened, not with anger but with memory. She had stood in places like this before, not polished, not safe, places where you were always being watched, always evaluated. Only back then mistakes didn't cost pride or reputation, they cost lives. The habit of silence had been drilled into her bones. You learned quickly that speaking too soon, reacting too fast got people killed. You learned patience. You learned restraint. You learned how to let others underestimate you and still do what needed to be done. Brant's voice carried again, louder now, feeding off the attention. He enjoyed this part, the setup, the slow dismantling of someone else's confidence for public consumption. Kane didn't look at him. She focused on the range ahead, the way the flag snapped and stilled, snapped again. Wind was never constant. People were worse. The bet hit the bench with a dull thud. Money always sounded heavier than it actually was. The sponsor leaned in, invading her space, his grin too close, too confident. Kane felt her jaw tighten, not because she felt threatened, but because she recognized the move. He wasn't betting on her skill. He was betting on her discomfort, on her needing the money, on her needing approval. She didn't respond right away. She let the silence stretch. Silence unsettled people like him. It left them alone with their assumptions. She thought of another man, years ago, sliding a different kind of offer across a different table. Promises wrapped in leverage. She learned then that dignity wasn't something you defended loudly. It was something you refused to trade. "I'm not competing," she said finally. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, just confirming. The range owner's arrival brought a different tension. Authority had its own gravity. Cyrus watched her like she was an equation he couldn't quite solve. She saw the calculation behind his eyes. Risk, liability, control. He wanted her to either conform or disappear. The imaginary waiver, the comments about insurance, those weren't rules. They were pressure. Kane nodded again, accepting the space he allowed without gratitude. Gratitude would imply she'd asked for permission. As she prepared, small acts of disrespect piled up, the bumped bench, the muttered comment, each one designed to fray her focus. She noticed them all, logged them, let them pass. Her heart rate stayed low. That was the trick. You didn't fight distraction. You acknowledged it, then let it drift away. Ignored shifted into anxious. Not fear, anticipation. The kind that sat just below the skin, making everything sharper. She could feel the weight of eyes now. Expectations changing shape. Some wanted her to fail. Some wanted her to surprise them. Neither mattered. The wind gusted harder. She almost smiled, almost. The target slid into place far downrange, impossibly small at that distance. A murmur rippled through the crowd, standing, iron sights. The math didn't add up for them. Kane felt the familiar grounding of her boots against the concrete. She looped the sling high, feeling the pressure settle into muscle and bone. This was where she belonged, not here exactly, but in this moment, in the space between breath and decision. The PA system crackled. The circus whistle sound sliced through the air, juvenile and cruel. Laughter followed. Kane's stomach tightened, not because of embarrassment, but because she recognized the tactic. Noise, chaos, break the rhythm. She closed her eyes for half a second, just long enough to reset. She remembered a night when flares turned the sky white and sound came from every direction at once. How she'd learned then to narrow the world to one thing, one task, one truth. She opened her eyes. Brant turned away. That hurt more than the insults. Dismissal always did. Being ignored once again, only this time it carried expectation. He didn't think she was worth watching. That was fine. She didn't need him to see. She needed the rifle to speak. The countdown started somewhere behind her. She let it wash over her without attaching to it. Numbers were just noise. She focused on the shimmer above the berm, the subtle shift in light that told her more than any digital display ever could. The flash went off. White light, peripheral burn. She blinked once. Breathing steady, shoulders loose, grip firm but not tight. She took up the slack in the trigger, feeling the familiar resistance. This wasn't about proving anything. It was about truth, about whether the world still worked the way she remembered. The rifle cracked. Time stretched. That suspended moment where everything balanced on possibility. She felt the urge to look back, to confirm, to seek reaction. She didn't. She stayed with the shot, followed through like she always had. Then the sound came back to her. Metal, clean, final. Her chest loosened. Not joy, relief. A quiet exhale she didn't realize she'd been holding for years. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't dismissive. It was stunned, uncertain. She felt eyes on her again, this time searching, recalibrating. She cycled the bolt, smooth, familiar. The second round chambered with a soft click. She felt something shift inside her, confidence maybe, or acceptance. The doubt that had lived quietly in her chest since she'd walked away from that other life loosened its grip. The second shot rang out just as clean. The murmurs grew louder, accusations bubbled up, glitches, sensors, luck. Kane listened without listening. She knew better than to argue with disbelief. Disbelief always looked for excuses. She chambered the third round. This one mattered. She adjusted her stance by a fraction, tracking the subtle swing of the target. Timing, patience. She remembered a voice from long ago, steady, calm, telling her that precision wasn't about hitting what you saw. It was about understanding what would be there when the bullet arrived. She waited. Fired. The chain snapped. The reaction hit her a half-second later. Gasps, shouts, something dropping to the floor. Kane lowered the rifle slowly. Her hands trembled just a little now, not from nerves but release. The weight of years pressed down, then eased. She felt broken and whole at the same time. She didn't turn around yet. She stayed with the rifle, grounding herself. She knew this moment would change things, not just for them, but for her. Sometimes, you don't realize how much you've been carrying until you finally set it down. Why did the room feel smaller the moment the truth landed? Kane sensed it before anyone spoke. The air changed. Not the temperature, something denser. Like the walls had moved in a fraction, forcing everyone to stand closer to a reality they hadn't planned on meeting. She stayed where she was, rifle still resting against her shoulder, eyes forward. She had learned a long time ago not to rush the aftermath. Impact always arrived before understanding. Voices overlapped behind her. Confusion, anger, denial dressed up as logic. Someone laughed too loudly, the sound brittle and wrong. Kane didn't turn around. Turning around too soon would invite questions, and questions led to explanations. She wasn't ready for that. She wasn't sure she ever would be. Her pulse slowed as the echo faded. She felt the concrete through her boots, the sling biting gently into her arm. These sensations grounded her, reminded her she was here. Now, not somewhere else. Not back in places that still visited her in the quiet hours of the night. She remembered another silence once, after a shot fired from a rooftop half a world away. The way time had stretched then, too. How the world seemed to wait, holding its breath before consequences arrived. That silence had ended differently, with orders, with movement, with a name whispered into a radio she never heard again. This silence felt heavier. She cycled the bolt once more, not because she needed another round, but because ritual mattered. Ritual kept you steady when emotions tried to creep in. The murmurs grew louder. Accusations sharpened. Words like sensor error and malfunction floated through the space, desperate attempts to reclaim control. Someone brushed past her shoulder, too close. She stiffened, instinct flaring before logic could catch up. Her body remembered threats even when her mind knew better. She forced herself to breathe through it. Slow in, slower out. Then she heard a different sound. Boots measured, confident, not rushed, not panicked. The older man stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. He hadn't laughed earlier, hadn't raised a phone. Kane had clocked him without consciously noticing, weathered cap, quiet posture, eyes that missed nothing. The kind of man who knew when to speak and when to wait. Recognition passed across his face like a shadow. Not all. Understanding, that was worse somehow. Understanding meant history, it meant context. Before he could speak, the guard surged forward. Kane saw it in her peripheral vision. The sudden movement, the hand drifting toward authority it didn't deserve. Her muscles tightened. This time, she didn't have to tell herself to stay still. Stillness was already there, coiled and ready. She knew how this could go. She lived the version where someone panicked and made a mistake that couldn't be undone. The guard crossed the line. Hands on her weapon. Time fractured. Her grip tightened, reflex screaming. For a split second, the world narrowed to threat and response. She could end it. She knew exactly how. The knowledge was immediate, instinctive, terrifyingly easy. Then the older man moved. Fast, clean, controlled. The guard's arm twisted back with a sound that made the room flinch. Authority snapped into place like a command remembered by the body before the mind caught up. The veteran's voice cut through everything, low, steady, absolute. "Touch that rifle," he said, "and you'll be answering to people you don't want to meet." The guard froze. The room froze with him. Kane exhaled. She felt the adrenaline ebb, leaving a hollow ache behind. Her hands trembled just a little now. Not fear, aftershock, the cost of restraint. The veteran released the guard and turned toward the others. His gaze swept the room, hard and unyielding. "You think this is sport," he said quietly. "You think it's entertainment. You have no idea what you're standing next to." His eyes flicked to Kane, not lingering, respectful, like he understood the weight of attention and didn't want to add to it. "You're looking at a ghost," he continued, "and ghosts do miss." The words landed heavier than applause ever could. Kane lowered the rifle slowly, deliberately. She safed it, set it on the bench. The metal felt warm beneath her fingers, alive. She reached into her bag without looking, fingertips finding the familiar edge of the card. Flat, cool, worn smooth by years of being carried and never shown. She placed it on the bench. No announcement, no explanation. Just fact. The light caught the faint etching, barely visible unless you knew what to look for. Most of them didn't. A few did. She watched their faces change, the way brows furrowed, the way mouths opened then closed again. Confusion gave way to something closer to unease. The veteran nodded once, that was all. "That program shut down years ago," he said. "Records buried so deep they don't officially exist. If she's holding that," he trailed off. He didn't need to finish. Didn't finish meant survived something others hadn't. Kane felt something twist in her chest. Not pride, not shame, grief, old and familiar. The kind that never really left, just learned to stay quiet. The range officers scrambled now, voices sharp with urgency. Diagnostics, wind logs, verification. They needed data to protect themselves. She understood that too. Institutions always looked inward first. The confirmations came back clean. No anomalies. No errors. Truth stood there, inconvenient and undeniable. Phones that had been raised for mockery now recorded something else entirely. Awe, fear, reverence. Kane felt exposed in a way she hadn't expected. She hated that part, being seen like this. Not as invisible, not as dismissed, but as something other. She didn't want to be other. The sponsor stared at the monitor, at the dangling target, at the severed chain swinging uselessly in the wind. His bravado drained away, leaving something small and confused behind. The money on the bench suddenly looked ridiculous, paper pretending to matter. He waited, everyone did. Kane looked at the cash, then passed it. She bent down and picked up a single empty casing from the concrete. Light, spent. It fit perfectly between her fingers. She placed it on top of the stack of bills and stepped back. The message was simple. This meant more than all of that. Turning away felt heavier than staying. She slung the rifle case over her shoulder, muscles protesting now that the adrenaline was gone. Every step toward the exit felt like walking out of a memory she tried not to reopen. Someone asked her name. She didn't answer. Brant finally spoke, his voice stripped of performance. "Who are you?" Kane paused just long enough to consider the question. Then she shook her head, not unkindly. "It doesn't matter," she said. "I just needed to know something." She pushed through the glass doors into the mountain air, leaving the room behind her in pieces. Some truths don't ask to be believed. They simply arrive, and leave you to decide what to do with the silence that follows. Why did walking away feel heavier than pulling the trigger ever had? The mountain air hit Kane's face as she stepped outside, sharp and clean, like it was trying to wake her up. For a moment she just stood there, one hand on the strap of her rifle case, the other hanging loose at her side. Inside, the noise had resumed. Murmurs, frantic explanations, the brittle laughter of people trying to pretend nothing fundamental had shifted. Out here, there was only wind and distance. Her legs felt heavier now. Adrenaline always lied on the way in and collected its debt on the way out. Each step toward the parking lot tugged at muscles she hadn't asked to remember the past so vividly. She welcomed the ache. Pain meant she was present. Pain meant she was here, not there. She started down the long slope toward the gravel lot. The same path she'd walked earlier, dismissed and invisible. It looked different now. Not because of what had happened behind her, but because she was different. Something had loosened inside her, and the absence felt strange. Like removing a piece of armor you worn so long you forgot it wasn't skin. Halfway down, her phone vibrated in her pocket. She stopped. For a second she considered letting it ring. No one from that world ever called without consequence. But the vibration came again, more insistent. She pulled the phone out, staring at the number. Blocked. Of course. She answered without speaking. "I saw the footage," a voice said, older, controlled, familiar in a way that tightened her chest. "You still shoot standing." Kane closed her eyes, just for a second. That voice carried weight she hadn't felt in years, authority without arrogance, recognition without judgment. "I do," she said quietly. Silence stretched. She could almost hear the man on the other end choosing his words carefully. That, more than anything, confirmed what she already knew. The clips had gone where they weren't supposed to go. "You shouldn't have been there," he finally said. She almost laughed, almost. "Neither should you," she replied. It wasn't accusation, just truth. Another pause. Wind rattled the scrub around her boots. "They're asking questions," he said. "The wrong people." Kane looked back up the hill at the glass building, sunlight glinting off its clean lines. It looked fragile from here, like something that believed too much in its own permanence. "Let them," she said. There was a time when that sentence would have terrified her, when being noticed meant danger, when staying hidden was survival, but something had shifted, not recklessness, resolve. "You always did this your way," the voice said. There was something close to admiration there, or regret. "You proved your point." "I didn't prove anything," Kane said. "I checked a zero." Another silence, this one heavier, final. "Take care of yourself," the man said at last. "You earned that much." The line went dead. Kane stood there longer than she meant to, phone still in her hand. Earned. The word sat wrong, like it belonged to a ledger she'd never agreed to keep. You didn't earn peace. You survived long enough to feel it, or you didn't. She slid the phone back into her pocket and continued down the hill. The valet saw her coming and broke into a jog, panic written all over his face. He held her keys out like an offering, breathless apologies tumbling over each other. Free detailing, preferred parking, anything, everything. She took the keys without slowing. Their fingers brushed for half a second. His hand was shaking. "It's okay," she said. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't absolution. It was simply the truth. His mistake didn't define her. Letting it go felt lighter than carrying it. Her truck waited where she'd left it, dust-coated and unbothered. She set the rifle case carefully in the back, climbed into the driver's seat and shut the door. The interior smelled faintly of oil and pine. Familiar. Safe. She didn't start the engine right away. Her hands rested on the wheel, and for the first time since she'd pulled into the lot, she allowed herself to feel it all at once. The dismissal, the anger, the relief, the grief that had cracked open when she wasn't looking. Tears burned behind her eyes, surprising her with their insistence. She didn't wipe them away. She let them come, quiet, unseen. Crying had never been weakness. It was release. A pressure valve opening after years of holding everything in. She breathed through it, slow and steady, until the ache softened into something bearable. Eventually, she turned the key. The engine rumbled to life. She eased the truck onto the road and drove away from Apex Ridge without looking back. Word traveled faster than she did. By the time she reached the highway, her phone buzzed again. Messages she didn't open. Missed calls she didn't answer. Screenshots sent by people who hadn't spoken to her in years. Headlines forming in private threads. Speculation stacking on speculation. She ignored it all. She took the turnoff toward the hills instead of the city, the road narrowing as it climbed. The landscape changed from polished wealth to quiet resilience. Pines, rock, sky. This was where she'd rebuilt herself, piece by piece, without witnesses. Her place sat tucked against a ridge, small and unassuming. She parked, unloaded the rifle, and carried it inside. The house smelled of clean wood and old books. She set the case on the table and unzipped it slowly. The rifle lay there unchanged, honest. She cleaned it the way she always did. Methodical, respectful, each motion a meditation. As she worked, memories surfaced, not the worst ones but the quiet ones. Shared jokes, sunrises after long nights. The feeling of being part of something that mattered even when no one knew. When she finished, she hung the rifle on the rack and stepped back. For a long moment she just stood there, listening to the house settle. Outside, night crept in. Stars emerged one by one, patient and indifferent. She stepped onto the porch, wrapped a jacket around herself and sat. She thought about the people back at the range, how their certainty had cracked, how their world had tilted just enough to let something real seep in. She didn't feel satisfaction. She felt distance, like watching a storm pass over land you no longer lived on. For years, she'd carried the weight of being unseen as a kind of punishment she hadn't questioned. Today had reminded her of something she'd forgotten. Being invisible was a choice she'd made to survive. Being seen was a choice she could make to live. She leaned back, eyes tracing constellations she half-remembered names for, and let the quiet hold her. Some victories don't echo. They settle slowly, gently, into the places you thought would always stay broken. What happens after the noise fades, when the world moves on but you do? Morning came softly, the way it always did in the hills. No alarms, no schedules written by other people, just light slipping through the trees and settling against the window like it belonged there. Cain woke before she needed to, a habit that never quite left. Her body still trusted early warning more than comfort. She lay still for a moment, listening. Wind through pine needles, a bird testing the air, the house breathing around her. Peace used to make her uneasy. Silence once meant something had gone wrong. Now it was just silence, Or at least she was learning to let it be. She swung her legs out of bed and stood, feeling the stiffness in her joints. Yesterday had taken more than she'd expected. Not physically, emotionally. Opening doors you'd welded shut always left sharp edges. Coffee helped, so did routine. She moved through the small kitchen with practiced ease, hands steady, thoughts quieter than they'd been in a long time. The phone sat face down on the counter. She hadn't checked it since the drive home. She knew what would be there. Messages dressed as concern. Curiosity pretending to be respect. People wanting pieces of her story without carrying any of its weight. She didn't owe anyone that. Still, avoidance had its limits. After the second cup, she flipped the phone over. Dozens of notifications, missed calls, one voicemail flagged urgent. She didn't open any of them. Instead, she stepped outside. The air was colder this morning, thin and honest. She walked the short path behind the house, boots pressing into damp earth. At the edge of the clearing stood the makeshift range she'd built herself years ago. Nothing fancy, just steel, distance, and trust. She stopped halfway there. For the first time since she'd moved out here, she hesitated. Not because she doubted herself, but because she didn't know what she needed anymore. For years, shooting had been how she stayed connected to something she couldn't name. Discipline, memory, proof. Yesterday, she'd proven what she came to prove. The zero held. The skill hadn't faded. The past hadn't erased her. Now what? The question sat heavy in her chest. She thought of the faces at the range, the shock, the fear, the way some of them had looked at her afterward, not as a person but as a symbol. She hated that. Symbols were easy to admire and easier to misunderstand. She wasn't a lesson. She was tired. Kane turned back toward the house, leaving the range untouched. That choice felt heavier than any shot she'd taken. Growth often did. Inside, the voicemail notification blinked again. She listened this time. The voice was younger, female, controlled but strained around the edges, someone trying hard not to sound desperate. "My name is Elise," the woman said. "I don't know if you'll remember me, probably not. I was 2 rotations behind you, different teams, but I saw what happened yesterday, and I just wanted to say thank you. I didn't know it was possible to walk away and still be whole. If you ever feel like talking, I'd listen." The message ended abruptly, like the speaker hadn't trusted herself to say more. Kane stared at the wall long after the phone went quiet. Ignored, broken, hopeful. The emotions tangled together in a way that made her chest ache. She hadn't thought about the people who came after her, not really. She'd assumed the program disappearing meant the story ended there, clean, contained. But ghosts had a way of echoing forward, not just back. She carried the phone to the window and watched clouds drift slow and unbothered across the sky. Talking had never been her strength, neither had being an example. She'd always preferred to work in the margins, where expectations couldn't reach. But Elise's voice lingered. Not admiration, relief. That was different. Kane sat down at the table and typed a reply, deleted it, typed another, deleted that too. Words felt inadequate, dangerous, final. Eventually, she settled on something simple. "You're already whole," she wrote. "You just don't see it yet." She stared at the message for a long moment before sending it. The rest of the day passed slowly, intentionally. She repaired a loose step on the porch, cleaned gear that didn't need cleaning, cooked a meal she barely tasted. Her body was busy, her mind less so. In the afternoon, a truck drove past her place without stopping. Then another. She watched from the window, tension tightening her shoulders before easing again. No one knocked. No one came up the drive. Good. By evening, the sky had shifted into softer colors. Kane stepped back onto the porch and sat with her hands folded loosely in her lap. She thought about the version of herself that had walked into Apex Ridge the day before, quiet, prepared, braced for dismissal. That woman still existed. But she wasn't alone anymore. Not because people knew her name now, but because she'd stopped pretending she didn't matter unless someone else said so. She remembered something an instructor once told her, long before everything went wrong. "You don't get to decide when your story ends," he'd said, "only how honestly you live while it's still being written." She hadn't understood that then. She'd been too focused on survival. Now, sitting under a darkening sky, she felt the truth of it settle in. Survival was a chapter. So was silence. So was being unseen. But none of them had to be the ending. Her phone buzzed once more. A reply from Elise. "Thank you," it read. "I didn't know I needed to hear that." Kane set the phone aside and leaned back, eyes closing briefly as the first stars appeared. She didn't know what came next, teaching maybe, or nothing at all. A quieter life lived on her own terms. For the first time in a long while, uncertainty didn't scare her. Sometimes, redemption isn't about going back or proving anything new. Sometimes, it's about allowing yourself to stand still and realizing the ground beneath you was solid all along. When did she realize the past no longer had to decide the future? The night stretched long and quiet, the kind that invited reflection whether you wanted it or not. Kane lay awake longer than usual, eyes tracing shadows along the ceiling as the house settled around her. She wasn't haunted, not the way she used to be, but something was shifting, rearranging itself slowly inside her. The kind of change that didn't announce itself with noise or urgency. It simply asked to be acknowledged. She rose before dawn again, pulled on a jacket and stepped outside. The sky was still dark but lighter at the edges, a promise forming. She stood on the porch and breathed deeply, letting the cold sharpen her senses. In the distance, the hills held their shape without asking anything of her. She liked that about them. Her phone buzzed once in her pocket. She ignored it at first. Old habits died hard, but then she sighed softly and checked the screen. Another message from Elise. "I keep thinking about what you said," it read. "About already being whole. I don't know if I believe it yet, but I want to. I just wanted you to know that." Kane stared at the words for a long time. Belief was tricky. You could survive for years without it, thrive even, but living that required something more fragile, more honest. She typed back slowly, choosing each word with care. "You don't have to believe it all at once," she wrote. "Just don't let anyone convince you you're broken." She sent it and slipped the phone back into her pocket before doubt could catch up. Later that morning, she drove into town for supplies. It wasn't something she did often, but the cupboards were thin and she felt ready to be around people again, at least a little. The hardware store clerk recognized her, not from the range, from before, from years of small interactions that hadn't meant much at the time. "Morning," he said, friendly but unassuming. "Morning," she replied. That was it, no looks, no questions, no expectations. It felt normal. At the grocery store, she passed a television mounted near the registers. A muted news segment played on the screen. She caught a glimpse of Apex Ridge's logo before turning away. She didn't need to hear the commentary. She already knew how the story would be told, stripped of nuance, polished into something easily consumed. She paid and left without slowing. Back home, she unloaded the truck and paused, hands resting on a bag of grain she hadn't planned to buy. An idea nudged at her, not fully formed but persistent. She carried the bag inside, set it down, and moved toward the back room where the rifle hung. She stood there for a long time, looking at it. The rifle wasn't a symbol to her. It was a companion, a responsibility, a reminder of what precision cost and what it protected. She took it down, checked it out of habit, then surprised herself by carrying it back to the rack and leaving it there. Not today. Instead, she pulled out an old notebook from a drawer. The pages were blank, yellowed at the edges. She sat at the table, pen hovering, unsure where to begin. Writing felt exposed in a way shooting never had. Bullets didn't second-guess themselves. She wrote anyway. Not tactics, not memories, just thoughts, fragments, things she'd never said out loud, about being underestimated, about silence mistaken for weakness, about the quiet pride of doing something well without applause. The words came slowly at first, then faster. She didn't notice the time passing until sunlight shifted across the floor. In the afternoon, a knock came at the door. Kane froze. No one knocked here, ever. She moved carefully, heart rate climbing despite herself. Old instincts stirred, unwelcome but understandable. She peered through the window. The veteran from the range stood on the porch. He looked smaller here somehow, less imposing without concrete walls and spectators. Just an older man in a worn jacket, hands visible, posture respectful. She opened the door but didn't step aside. "I hope this isn't crossing a line," he said. His voice was quieter than she remembered. "I wouldn't have come if I didn't think it mattered." She studied him for a moment, then nodded once and stepped back. Inside, he took in the space without comment. The simplicity, the order, the rifle on the wall. Understanding flickered again, but he didn't linger on it. "I won't stay long," he said. "I just wanted you to know something." She waited. "People like you," he continued, choosing his words carefully, "don't disappear when programs end. You scatter, and sometimes the world forgets what it owes you." She felt a familiar tightening in her chest. "The world doesn't owe me anything." He nodded. "You're right, but the people coming up behind you, they owe you visibility, whether you want it or not." She looked away. Visibility had a cost she wasn't sure she wanted to pay. "I'm not asking you to be a symbol," he added, as if reading her thoughts. "Just don't vanish completely. Some of them need to see what quiet competence looks like." They stood in silence for a moment. Finally she spoke. "I'm not who they think I am." He smiled faintly. "That's usually how it works." When he left, Kane stood at the door long after his truck disappeared down the road. That evening she sat on the porch again, notebook in her lap. She wrote until the stars came out, then kept writing. Not for anyone else, for herself. To trace the outline of a life that didn't revolve around erasing who she'd been or clinging to it. She thought about teaching, not formally, not in uniforms and ranks, just passing on what mattered: patience, awareness, respect for the craft, respect for oneself. She thought about Elise and others like her. The idea no longer felt heavy, it felt possible. As the night deepened, Kane closed the notebook and rested her hands on its cover. She felt tired in a good way, the kind that came from honesty, not exhaustion. She looked up at the sky and smiled faintly. She hadn't reclaimed anything. She hadn't proven anything. She'd simply stopped hiding from herself. Tomorrow would come, with questions, with choices, with uncertainty. But tonight was enough. Sometimes dignity doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand attention or permission. It stands quietly in the truth of what it knows, and lets the world catch up when it's ready.